On the morning of March 23, 2001, 41-year-old Rose Marie Moniz began what should have been an ordinary day. She had a doctor's appointment scheduled and her father had promised to pick her up and drive her there. She went about her morning routine in the small New Bedford home she lived in, a home she thought of as a safe place. Her father arrived at the home, expecting to see her ready to go, but when he reached the door, he noticed it was unlocked, which was odd but not alarming enough to cause panic. He stepped inside, calling her name, but the silence that greeted him was heavy. He moved through the house, first the kitchen and then the living room, each step building an unease that knotted in his chest. Finally, he reached the bathroom door, and what he saw froze him in place. Rose was sprawled across the tiled floor, her body twisted unnaturally. Blood was smeared across the tiles and pooled beneath her head, thick and dark. The stark white porcelain of the sink and toilet was flecked with red droplets and smears that told a frantic, violent struggle in the confined space. Her purse had been dumped on the ground, its contents scattered, coins and crumpled bills glinting dully in the bloody mess, as though someone had tried to make the scene look like a robbery. But the real horror was in her injuries, visible even before a medical examiner touched her. Her face was swollen, molted purple and blue, with bone visibly shifting under the skin. Her hair was matted with blood, and she had been beaten savagely, again and again, until her skull could no longer withstand the force. Nearby lay the objects that had been used, a heavy iron fireplace poker bent slightly at its shaft, a cast iron kettle splattered with gore, and most grotesque of all was a large conch shell. Its natural ridges stained a deep red, streaks of blood drying along its spiral. Police arrived and the scene was quickly recognized as one of shocking brutality. Even seasoned investigators, men and women who had all walked into murder scenes many times before, felt a chill as they looked over the bathroom. There was a sense of overkill, of rage, that had pushed the attacker to use anything within reach to keep bludgeoning her. It was not enough to strike once or twice. No, the killer had continued until Rose's body could not endure another blow. The autopsy painted the full picture of her suffering. Rose had multiple skull fractures, her cranial bones shattered in several places. Her nasal bridge had fully collapsed, with her cheekbones cracked apart. The blows were so forceful that the blood had spilled into her ears, seeping into her skull as her brain swelled with trauma. There were deep lacerations where the scalp had split open under repeated strikes, each wound ragged and surrounded by swelling. The medical examiner noted contusions across her face and jaw, blunt injuries layered upon one another until the features that once made her recognizable had been transformed into something unrecognizable. What set this crime apart was the discovery of pattern abrasions. Across Rose's face were scratches and gouges that did not come from the flat edges of a poker or the rounded surface of a kettle. They matched perfectly to the spiny ridges of the decorative conch shell found at the scene. The shell had essentially been turned into a medieval weapon, gripped from the inside and swung against bone and flesh. Its ridges dug deep into her skin, leaving behind their imprint and a grotesque mirror of its natural design. The thought that someone had pressed their hand into the hollow of a conch shell, an object usually displayed for beauty or as a keepsake, and used it to cave in a woman's face was almost too much for the investigators to process. The investigation would begin immediately, but the chaos of the scene made it difficult. At first, the scattered purse contents suggested robbery, but the details contradicted it. No significant money was missing. The force and overkill suggested anger, perhaps personal anger rather than theft. Detectives would speak to family members, neighbors, friends, or anyone who might have had a motive. Rose's son, Bobby, was questioned and even suspected for a time, simply because of his proximity and the pressure investigators were under to identify a suspect. Though he was cleared, the suspicion clung to him. The brutality was undeniable, leaving him with not only grief but stigma. Two other men became suspects as well, but without any physical evidence tying them to the crime, charges were never filed. The brutality was undeniable, but the killer had left no obvious fingerprints, no eyewitnesses had seen anything, and in 2001, the DNA techniques available were limited. Months would stretch on into years, leads would dry up, and eventually the case was declared cold. For the family, there was no closure. Rose's father could not erase the image of her broken body on the floor. Bobby grew into adulthood marked by the whispers of suspicion and the ache of never knowing who had taken his mother's life. The shell, the poker, and the kettle remained locked away in evidence storage, grim reminders of an unanswered crime. Now, nearly 2 decades later in 2019, the case was reopened by the Bristol County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit and the Massachusetts State Police. Advances in forensic science had given investigators hope. They pulled the evidence from storage and re-examined every single detail. The conch shell, once considered simply part of the carnage, now stood as a potential key. The unique marks it left on Rose's face were impossible to ignore, and detectives reasoned that if the killer had gripped it from the inside, the DNA could still linger, skin cells and sweat, microscopic traces that 2001 scientists couldn't detect but modern technology could. Forensic technicians would carefully swab the inside of the cavity of the shell. The work was painstaking, but the results were remarkable. They recovered a full DNA profile from the inside of the shell. It was uploaded to CODIS, the national database, and a match appeared almost instantly. The DNA belonged to Rose's own half-brother, David Reed. The revelation was staggering. Reed was no stranger to violence. His DNA was in the system because of a 2003 armed robbery where he had beaten a woman with a tire iron and stolen her purse, leaving her injured on the street. He had served time for that crime, and his profile had remained in the system. Now, it tied him directly to the murder of his sister. Investigators explained that there was no plausible way his DNA would be inside that conch shell unless he had held it in his hand and wielded it as a weapon. In 2021, Reed was arrested and charged with Rose's murder, nearly 20 years after the crime. For the family, it was like ripping open an old wound. The man who had carried Rose's coffin as a pallbearer at her funeral, the man who had stood with them in grief, was the very same person who had crushed her skull in that bathroom. This betrayal would cut deep. For Bobby, the news was bittersweet though. It cleared him of the dark cloud of suspicion he had carried since his youth, but it replaced it with the unbearable knowledge that his own uncle had slaughtered his mother. Now, this case stands as one of the most disturbing and haunting in Massachusetts history, not only for the savagery of the crime, but for the bizarre weapon that ultimately solved it. The conch shell was swung with such a force that it gouged her face and left her unrecognizable, became the silent witness that spoke 2 decades later. The brutality of her final moments, the blows raining down on her with cast iron with the shell, was almost medieval in its cruelty. The unique imprint of the shell that provided the evidence to finally deliver some justice. Verdun in the 1970s was a picture of ordinary Canadian life. A riverside suburb of Montreal, it was lined with brick duplexes and narrow sidewalks where kids played street hockey until dark. There were corner stores run by families who had known their customers for decades, and the same familiar faces could be found in the bakeries, butcher shops, and little pizza parlors that dotted the neighborhood. Parents kept their front doors unlocked. Teenagers walked in packs, laughing down the streets. The kind of neighborhood where mothers leaned out the windows to call their children in for supper, confident they'd come running back safe. But safety in Verdun was more of an illusion than reality. Behind the glow of the street lamps, the neighborhood bled into alleys, wood patches, and shadowed paths. It was the kind of place where the wrong encounter could turn familiar ground into a trap. It was into that setting that 16-year-old Sharon Pryor stepped out on the evening of March 29, 1975. She was headed just a short walk from her family's home to meet her friends at a local pizza parlor. Nothing about the plan was unusual. It was something she had done countless times with other kids in Verdun that they all did all the time. She slipped on her jacket, called a goodbye to her mother, Vion, and stepped into the cool evening air. The walk should have taken minutes. For her, it was supposed to be an all-night of laughter and pizza. Her friends waited, but Sharon would never arrive. Her friends waited at the parlor, glancing at the door each time it opened, expecting her face to appear. When she didn't show, they assumed she was running late. An hour passed, then another. Calls were made, but by the next morning, when she still hadn't returned home, her family's unease hardened into fear. Fionne's voice trembled as she told the police her daughter was missing. Verdun, a neighborhood that always had felt safe, suddenly swarmed with searchers. Neighbors knocked on doors, police swept alleys and side streets, volunteers checked wooded paths. Posters went up bearing Sharon's smiling face, and for days her name was on everyone's lips. 4 days later, the search ended with horror. Sharon's body was discovered across the St. Lawrence River in Lingale. The spot was lonely and isolated, a patch of woods where few people went unless they had a reason to. For the officers who arrived, the scene was grim. Sharon had been beaten mercilessly, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The state of her body told the story. She had suffered a prolonged violent attack before life was taken. What had started as just a short walk through a familiar neighborhood had ended in the hands of a predator who dragged her into the shadows, and the autopsy would confirm this nightmare. Her body bore bruises and lacerations. She had been overpowered, terror carved into her final moments. The official cause of death was strangulation, but the examiner noted the savage beating alone could have been fatal. Now, it was not quick and it was nowhere near merciful. Sharon had endured brutality that defied imagination. The news shattered Verdun. Parents who let their children wander free now held them close. Teenagers who had walked the same streets without fear now looked over their shoulders. The illusion of safety collapsed in a single night. For Vaughn and for Sharon's sisters, the grief was unbearable. To lose a child was one thing, to know she had been brutalized in her last hours was another wound altogether, and one that could never truly heal. The police would launch an urgent investigation, with witnesses remembered a green Dodge with a vinyl roof near where Sharon was last seen. Detectives built lists of possible suspects, questioning dozens of men. They pursued every tip, but in 1975 the science wasn't there to support them. There were no DNA databases, no genetic matches waiting in a system. Investigators were left with blood typing, fingerprints, and unreliable eyewitness accounts, none of which would give them a conclusive answer. The trail, despite the urgency, would eventually go cold. For years, the case would sit unsolved. Yvonne never let it fade. She pushed, pleaded, and reminded police and reminded journalists. For decades, Sharon's face lingered in the memory of Verdun. People who had been teenagers at the time could still remember seeing her missing posters, could still remember the fear in their parents' voices. To them, her murder marked the moment the neighborhood lost its innocence. It wasn't until the 2000s the tide began to turn. Advances in forensic science allowed preserved evidence from Sharon's body to be retested. This time, investigators pulled a clear DNA profile of the killer. It was a monumental step forward, but when they compared it against Canadian databases, no matches appeared. The identity of the predator remained out of reach. Years later, the breakthrough came from across the border. Cooperation with American authorities allowed the DNA to be compared against profiles in the United States, and the match was chilling. Franklin Roman Noose, a US citizen with a history of violence who had been living in the Montreal area in the mid-1970s. Roman Noose was already dead by the time the match was made, but investigators confirmed the link through the DNA of his relatives. The predator who had taken Sharon, who had dragged her from Verdun, who had beaten, sexually abused her, and strangled her, had finally been unmasked. For Sharon's family, the news was bittersweet. After decades of waiting, they had the name of the man who stole her life. But justice was obviously impossible, as Roman Noose had died without facing trial. He would never be forced to look them in the eye, never hear a sentence handed down in court. Still, for the mother who had carried her daughter's absence like a weight for almost half a century, there was some peace in knowing the truth. She would eventually die in 2021, only shortly after learning the answers she had fought for all those years. The dinner table was set in the Leon household, plates were rearranged neatly, silverware was aligned, and the smell of food hung in the air. Their father, John, a familiar voice on Washington's radio waves, sat with their mother, Mary, and the rest of the family, waiting for the sound they knew so well. The swing of the front door, the quick footsteps, and the cheerful chatter of their two daughters, Sheila and Kate, returning from the mall. But the minutes stretched into an hour, and then longer still. The food cooled, conversation stalled, and the silence filled the space where two young voices should have been. By nightfall, dread had seeped into every corner of the house. Something was wrong. Earlier that afternoon, 12-year-old Sheila and 10-year-old Catherine Kate Leon had been full of excitement. Spring break meant freedom, and like countless kids in suburban Maryland, that freedom meant a trip to Wheaton Plaza, the sprawling shopping mall just a short walk from their kin-signed home. Their parents had given them the same instructions as always: stay together and be home for dinner. It was a ritual they knew by heart. The girls left with light jackets and the giddy confidence of children who believed the world around them was safe. Inside the mall, witnesses later remembered them wandering happily from shop to shop. They looked at Easter decorations, browsed records, and sat down at a pizza parlor to share some food. They were inseparable, smiling, laughing, and enjoying the kind of ordinary afternoons hundreds of other kids were having that same day. But they weren't alone. Among the crowds of shoppers, people noticed a man hanging near them. One described him carrying a tape recorder as if trying to capture their voices. Another recalled a long-haired man who seemed to follow them at a distance. None of it sparked alarm in the moment, and two young girls in a busy mall didn't look like they were in danger. But by the time the sun dipped, the sisters hadn't come home. And while their parents tried to reassure themselves with thoughts like, oh, maybe they lost track of time, the pit in their stomachs grew heavier with each passing moment. By nightfall, panic would set in, calls to neighbors and friends yielding nothing. John, the father who was used to projecting calm and steady confidence on the radio, now dialed 911 with shaking hands. The response was immediate and enormous. What began as missing children's report exploded into one of the largest searches Maryland had ever seen. Police officers, firefighters, volunteers, hundreds of people spread across neighborhoods, fields, and wooded lots. Helicopters scanned from above while officers combed the mall, interviewing shoppers and employees. Flyers with the girls' faces, Sheila with her wide smile, Kate with her youthful grin, were plastered across every pole and shop window. The community was gripped by fear. Parents who had once let their children roam free now pulled them close. And yet, despite the sheer scale of this search, there was nothing. No clothes, no belongings, no bodies. It was as if Sheila and Kate had been swallowed whole between the mall and their home. Leads would pile up, but they dissolved just as quickly. A green Dodge was seen near the mall, a man with a tape recorder, a vague sighting here, a rumor there, but every time police thought they had a break, the trail turned to dust. Days would become weeks, and weeks would become months. The sisters' faces stayed in the papers, their story replayed on the evening news, but there was no answers. The investigation would stall, leaving only grief and silence. For John and Mary, the torment was endless. John, in particular, borne the cruel weight of being a public figure. Each time he spoke on the airways, his voice carried over a city that knew his daughters' names, that watched him crumble in real time. For the community, the Leon sisters' disappearance shattered trust. Malls no longer felt safe, children were kept on tight leashes, with their loss became a symbol of innocence stolen. For decades, the case stayed cold. New detectives inherited the file, hoping they'd be the one to solve it. With rumors persisted, false confessions trickled in, and suspects came and went, but the truth stayed blurred. But the truth stayed buried. One name, though, had always been there, hiding in plain sight. Lloyd Lee Welch. On the very day the sisters vanished, Welch, then an 18-year-old drifter, had actually walked up to the police at the mall, claiming he had saw the girls leaving with a man. His story was messy and inconsistent. Investigators just wrote him off as another unreliable witness, maybe just a local kid desperate for attention. They didn't realize he was trying to throw him off the scent. As the decades passed, Welch built a criminal record of assaults and child sex offenses. Eventually, in the 2010s, detectives re-examining the case decided to look at him again. His old statements read less like confused rambling and more like deliberate misdirection. When they finally confronted him, he began to crack. Hours upon hours of interrogation revealed a web of contradictions. Welch shifted blame to his relatives, hinted at involvement, and denied it, then circled back with chilling admissions. Piece by piece, a horrifying picture emerged. He admitted that he and others had abducted Sheila and Kate from Wheaton Plaza, taking them to his family's property in Bedford County, Virginia. There, according to Welch's own words, the girls were held, assaulted, and killed. He said their bodies were destroyed, burned, and discarded in the woods, erasing almost every trace of their existence. Investigators searched the property decades later, digging through soil, debris, and ash. They would find fragments of bones, tiny remnants that lent weight to Welch's words, but no full remains. Even in death, the sisters had been robbed of their peace. In 2015, 40 years after the disappearance, Welch was finally charged. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony murder, admitting his role in their abduction and deaths. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison, a sentence that would assure he died behind bars.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.